this is a case where there has been a number of allegations of management resisting accountability, resisting scrutiny, really refusing to be curious about about a number of cases that should have caused concerns much earlier. And in terms of lessons for the wider NHS, there's a lot at stake here, because you get a lot of clinicians who say, look, when we try to raise things with managers, we are treated as an inconvenience, and that whistleblowers are treated very badly within the health service. And so actually, if you have a cultural problem across the health service, it may well be that those who are giving evidence aren't quite aware of how bad things have got, because it's become normalised.
The breaking story in the last hour or so, and it's a big one. The government, as we have been reporting, upgrading the inquiry into the serial killer Lucy Letby. It's going to be a statutory inquiry. It means there'll be powers to compel witnesses to give evidence. Let's have a listen back to the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, speaking a little earlier.
Now, in most non-statutory inquiries, the chairs of those inquiries have said they haven't had difficulties having people come forward with evidence. But having discussed it with the families, their preference was to have the inquiry on a statutory footing in order to have those stronger powers of compulsion. And when I announced that we would have an independent inquiry, I was very clear that we would shape that inquiry around the wishes of the families. My priority is to ensure that the families get the answers they deserve, that people are held to account where they need to be.
So the families of the victims in this case wanted a more powerful inquiry, and now they've got it, or they are to get it. And Isabel, you've been thinking about this. It's a good thing. It's clearly a good thing, maybe an absolutely necessary thing. When you look at some of the questions swirling in the air around the Lucy Letby killings, suggestions of those with worries at that Royal Chester Hospital being told to be quiet, having alarms raised but then alarms ignored, police being called in but only too late. Those are some of the questions being raised. You can see why an inquiry chair would want all the power that he can get to the truth, Isabel. I don't know if we lost Isabel there just for a moment. Rachel, necessary powers.
I would agree with all of that, and second what Isabel was saying a moment ago. I think it's very clear that in a case like this, having the powers to compel witnesses to give evidence is really important. And obviously in an ideal world you would want everyone to volunteer and to come forward, but from what we've heard, the reports in this case of concerns being raised, managers shutting down any kind of criticism, these doctors being told that they had to apologise for raising their concerns, why it was allowed to go on for so long, why these patterns weren't spotted. With everything that we've heard, do we really think that some of these individuals would come forward voluntarily and say, yes, that was a situation, and yes, these are the mistakes that I made, and I will hold myself accountable to that? I mean, they're probably not going to do that anyway. The thing is, you can compel people to turn up to give evidence. You can't compel them to give answers, and I think you're going to have a fair amount of fudging, or I wouldn't be able to answer that, and it was a bit more complicated than that. But I think just getting them there in the room to be held to account is very important and very necessary, and I would say more important for making sure this doesn't happen again than questions over whether or not Lucy Letby herself turned up for the sentencing remarks. I can understand the anger that she didn't, and I can understand the sense that the government should compel offenders to turn up for their sentencing and to face victims in that way. But really, that's not going to change anything for the future, whereas compelling witnesses in this case to come and give evidence and explain what went wrong, why it happened, and how to make sure it wouldn't happen again, that I think is more important going forward.
That's right. It's got to be right, Isabel, hasn't it? I mean, accountability, obviously enormously important, getting to the bottom of what went wrong at this hospital, but it's also about stopping it happen again. And if there were managers there who were saying, look, lay off Lucy Letby, in a way that could not now be justified, they need to be questioned about that. If there were managers there saying, look, you just keep that to yourself. If there were managers there who were far too late, later than could be justified in calling in police once the alarm is raised, they need to be questioned, and questioned very, very thoroughly about that. No one can force people to answer questions, because this is Britain. This is not some, totalitarian regime. But you can get close enough to reach a conclusion. And that's what the inquiry chairman needs to do.
Absolutely. And this is a case where there has been a number of allegations of management resisting accountability, resisting scrutiny, really refusing to be curious about about a number of cases that should have caused concerns much earlier. And in terms of lessons for the wider NHS, there's a lot at stake here, because you get a lot of clinicians who say, look, when we try to raise things with managers, we are treated as an inconvenience, and that whistleblowers are treated very badly within the health service. And so actually, if you have a cultural problem across the health service, it may well be that those who are giving evidence aren't quite aware of how bad things have got, because it's become normalised. I think there's two other problems here, which I think are really important. One is the possible hostility between doctors and nurses that seemed to be at play here, where you had nursing managers, nursing staff suggesting to a certain extent that the doctors were ganging up on a nurse, and anyone who works in the health service will be aware of that tension, which has a number of roots in terms of sort of professional gatekeeping, and so on. But also, I think whatever kind of inquiry this is going to be, or this turns out to be, the biggest problem is what the government then does with the lessons. Yes. Because when I interviewed the solicitor who worked with the families who had relatives killed by Harold Shipman on Times Radio a few weeks ago, she said that it took 10 years for some of these recommendations from that inquiry to be implemented at all. And so you really do then have this sort of pause after an inquiry where you get a very solemn statement in the House of Commons from the Prime Minister, an apology. But then what happens? It's very easy for ministers to then say, oh, we've got something else on. Let's hope that somebody else picks this up. Or, it's up to the professional bodies to implement this. Yeah. And for actual changes to fall between the gaps.
Yeah, a lot of heavy stones that need to be turned over and peered beneath. And it seems like the judge, the chair, will have the powers. Maybe it seems he needs to do that job.